Just think of an answer. And whoever hasn't seen this example before, shout out an answer. Who's got something for me? 7 minutes. Well, that's pretty aggressive, all right. Because six minutes gives us a thimble, so it's a big thimble for that next minute. 4 hours, 1 hour, and everybody else has some sort of an idea in their head. The answer is you have 50 minutes to escape from your handcuffs. 50 minutes. And I see some skeptics out there, so perhaps I've underestimated the size, the volume of that park by 100%. Okay? You get an extra minute. So think 12:51 if that helps you. Okay? That makes you feel better. That's not the important question. This is the important question. At what time is this stadium still 97% empty space? And how many people realize the seriousness of the predicament? 5 minutes before, it is still 97% empty space. So imagine this. All of human history from the first Australopithecus 3 million years ago to 1960 to put 3 billion people on the face of the planet. 40 more years to put the next 3 billion people on the planet. 11 years for the next 1 billion. We are now at 7 billion inhabitants on this planet. So you have 45 minutes, nothing's really happening. Last 5 minutes, it all seems to happen. That's the nature of exponential charts when you have something limited, like you've got a fixed size of the planet or a fixed stadium or anything that's fixed. Things go slowly at first and they speed up at the end. That's why they're really hard to understand. So if things feel like they're going faster today, it's because they are. So this was that chart I started with is an actual chart. It's a chart of human population, green's history. Red is the projection for the next 40 years or so. And this is the world we live in. It's a very different world from the one even my grandfather was inhabiting. So let me just skip past that part. Oil. Oil production follows a pattern. Again, it's not a linear chart. It's a chart that looks like this. Looks like a hockey stick. And this is actual production. And so the reason that this is interesting to us is because oil is the master resource. Oil is how we move 95% of everything from point A to point B. If we don't have oil, almost everything else in our global just-in-time delivery economy becomes an impossibility because it's no longer just in time, it's just a lot slower in time. And this chart is really interesting because we have a lot of data that suggests we know where the cap is on this stadium. We have an idea, a very fixed idea at this point, about how big our stadium for oil really is, how much we've got. And you'll notice that we are no longer at that flat, early 97% part of this story. We are very close to the last 5 minutes of this story. And I want to get to some of that data in a minute. But here's the idea. You are surrounded by exponential charts. They're everywhere. Not linear charts, but ones that have these curves to them. And so understanding that that's the nature of the world we live in is a really important concept. And it's a concept that happens to define the world in which we live. And I could put other things. These are some environmental curves. But I could put up number of paper clips sold or miles of road paved or number of airplanes sold. It wouldn't matter. They would all look the same. And so it's really important to understand that we live in a world surrounded by these sorts of charts. And because they're everywhere, and I could pull examples from all three E's, the real thing that I want to leave you with is the concept that when you live in an exponential world, you live in a world where things speed up towards the end. Things go very, very rapidly at the last few minutes of that story. It's not a linear story, and that's a really important concept for us. So by understanding that I'm surrounded by these exponential charts, it made the investing world for me just a little bit less confusing. And once I started to understand the role of energy in our current story, things became a little bit less confusing to me. And right now I want to make a definition here between two words, because I hear them a lot. Problems have solutions. If you're facing a problem, you can come up with a solution which gives you the opportunity to get back to the condition you were just in. They can be solved. Predicaments have outcomes. We have to manage those outcomes. And knowing which you're in is really critically important because if you are in a predicament but trying solutions out for which no solution exists, you're wasting time. And I will submit to you that my thesis is that we are facing an energy predicament and we're treating it as if it's a problem. And so, an example here, these two gentlemen have a problem on their hands. Apologies to any rock climbers, a very fake picture. But they can solve this problem in a number of ways. They could lower a rope, put a mattress down, but they can end up in the same condition they started in. This gentleman is facing a predicament. He has to manage an outcome. Is he going to land on his feet or is he going to belly flop? But no matter how fast he pinwheels his arms backwards trying a solution out, he's not going back to the top of the cliff. Knowing whether you're in a problem or predicament is critical to the decisions you make and whether you're going to manage an outcome or waste time. So I want to talk about what I consider to be a predicament in energy. And in particular, so here's oil production from one country, but I could show you 45 others that have an almost identical profile. And so this is looking at the barrels per day that the United States produced from 1920 on through to about current. And we see that the United States hit a peak of production right around 1970. And no matter what the United States has done, 3D seismic technology, different end-of-oil recovery methodologies, slant bottle brush drilling, ultra-deep rigs, you name it, it hasn't changed the basic slope of this story, which is we hit a peak, we went past peak, and the United States will never again achieve that same peak of production. No country that's gone past peak yet has managed to re-achieve its peak of production. Once you go past the peak, it's over. And that's simply, we can understand it in a single oil field. Once you tap a single oil field and it goes past its peak of production, there's just nothing there to get out of the ground. And if we aggregate that across hundreds of oil fields across an entire continent, you get the same story, just it looks like this. So for the United States, of course, after past peak, we still consume a lot more than we produce. And how do we solve that? Well, we import a lot. This is the import wedge for the United States, importing about 2/3 of its liquid petroleum needs. Now, here's the thing. People in the oil business are very picky about this. They say that before you can pump oil, you have to find it. And it's a law or something that they live by. So what we really care about is when did oil discoveries peak? Because in the United States, oil discoveries peaked in 1930 and production peaked in 1970, a 40-year gap. Well, it turns out, here's a nice chart. This is all the chart you ever need to understand where we are in the oil story. This is looking at world or global discoveries of oil by decade. And we see that the 1960s were the peak decade of discoveries. 1964 being the peak year, but it's irrelevant. By decade is good. Green is history, red is what we're projecting, we're hoping we're going to find. And you read about things all the time. Oh, in Brazil, they found 30 gigabarrels in the Tupi salt fields. It's an extraordinary find, largest in a decade, and it's true. But 30 gigabarrels on this chart is about the size of that first green bar all the way to your left. That's the largest find in the past decade. Well, if you have to find it before you pump it, and there's about a 40-year gap between when you have your discovery peak and you have your production peak, this chart should tell us everything about where we might be in the oil story. It's a little over 40 years ago since we had our world discovery peak, and we are already seeing some troubling signs in oil production figures. This is a chart that came out from the International Energy Agency in 2008. It should have been on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, and we should still be talking about it, and it went by with barely a blip. Prior to developing this chart, which shows where we are in the oil story, the IEA had always put out its projections of how much oil we were going to get out of the ground by going to economists and asking, how much is the economy going to grow? And the economists would say 5% a year, and the IEA would go back and plug that in and say, well, I guess we're going to make this much oil then. In 2008, they said, hey, wait a minute, what if we actually add up all the oil fields that we know about and actually put them in a database and ask a different question, which is how much can they produce based on known depletion parameters? And they came up with this chart. And this one was a doozy. Now remember, this came out in 2008. The first thing we noted was that they admitted that big blue blob on the bottom, that big blue wedge on the bottom, that is oil from currently producing fields, a euphemism for cheap and easy. They admitted that we were past peak for cheap and easy oil. That means inexpensive oil is in the rear view mirror. This was a startling admission. And then the next blue wedge up is crude oil from fields yet to be developed. We know they're there. We're gonna have to drill a lot of things. But we basically know that's there. Look at that red wedge. That next red wedge is crude oil from fields yet to be found. It's called the wedge of hope. We hope we find that stuff, right? And what if we don't? So the first thing that was really important about this chart was they admitted that we are past peak cheap and easy oil. That right there, full stop, that's everything anybody who cares about the future or who has a long-range plan needs to understand right away. It's a critical piece of information. And the second thing they did, which was really quiet, 2030, their projections had always been for 130 million barrels per day of annual production. They walked that all the way back to 105 million barrels. That was in 2008. In 2009, they walked it back a little further, 2010 a little further, and this year they just came out with their peak. They think we're going to get to 96 million barrels per day by 2030. They just keep walking it down in terms of what we're going to get. What we can guarantee you is the amount of oil that is now projected to come out of the ground over the next 20 years is a fraction of what we had been planning on and a fraction of what is needed to sustain the type of global growth that we've had over the prior 4 decades. Full stop. That is an important admission, and we should still be debating it endlessly. And in my country, at the national level, we're still not discussing it at all. So there's a peak here, and there's also a cap on the total amount of production that we might have that actually sits about where that bar is right now, and it's a really rather startling admission to be making. So the quantity of oil is something we should care about. Quantity, how much? How many millions of barrels per day? Is it 96, 103, whatever? But it's not the most important part of this story, and the part you haven't heard about yet, even if you've heard about peak oil, is this next part. Because you might have, but it's pretty rare people have heard about this. Here's the thing I worry about. We had an oil shock in the early 1970s. Jimmy Carter, president of my country at the time, put on a sweater and said we have a problem, and actually delivered a really prescient speech which everybody could read and say, wow, he spot on. We decided in my country to go with Morning in America, a different concept, and bought SUVs instead. The thing that I worry about is that we had oil shock 1 in the 70s, and then oil shock 2 came in 2008. And my worry is that people will look at that and say, well, there was 35 years between oil shocks, maybe it will be 35 between the next 2 oil shocks. And that would be true if and only if we weren't somewhere in our stadium with water pretty far up the stairs already. It is my prediction that we will be seeing the next oil shock maybe 3, maybe 4 years after the last one. We'll be seeing it somewhere between now and maybe 2013. And that is the nature of speeding up, the collapsing and compression of time that we would expect to see. So that's one prediction I have. But here's the important part. It turns out that what we care about is not how much money does oil cost, because we print money out of thin air, so what does it matter if it's $1 or $10 million? That's irrelevant. What we care about is if we have to spend 1 barrel of oil to get a barrel of oil, we no longer have what we need to run our society on. So what we care about is the energy return. It takes energy to find energy. There's steel involved and diesel and all kinds of things we have to do to go and find that energy. So this is a hypothetical chart that asks the question, hey, how much energy are we getting back from the energy that we have to put in as we explore? So energy out by energy in. The green on the bottom is the energy that we get back. The red is the energy that we have to use to get energy. The reason we care is because the green stuff is what we run our society on. It's how everybody got, it's how everybody got into this room. It's how we eat every day. When we go home tonight and we eat dinner, most of that food got there with a huge energy subsidy from oil in particular. So it's surplus energy we care about. And here's an interesting story. So when we first started, and it crosses at 1, because again, when you're spending 1 barrel to get 1 barrel, you have a 0% return off of that. That means you're keeping your engineers busy, but you're not delivering anything back to society that we can use. And the story is interesting because when we first started looking for oil, we were getting 100 to 1 or greater returns. The Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, it's only 1,100 feet down, and it's on land, and it's under pressure, and it's light, sweet crude. It's gorgeous, right? Maybe 200 or 300 to 1 returns for the Ghawar field. And then as we started going along in the 70s, we were chasing stuff, the smaller fields, some of it's offshore. We're getting still 25 to 1 returns. Look how much green is still under that. Huge amount of green. And then as we go forward, 1990s, maybe we're getting 18 to 1 to 10 to 1 returns from our oil finds. Still a huge amount of green under that. But when we consider what we're doing with tar sands today, or what we might be considering doing with tar shales, or the oil shales of the West, or what we're even doing with deep water drilling, we're actually getting oil returns closer to 3 to 1. Note that when we go from 100 to 1 to 3 to 1, it's not a nice straight line like the ones we intuitively understand. This is a non-linear curve. It means that there's a cliff that we can face, where once we get up about maybe 5 to 1 or less, we suddenly fall off very rapidly down this energy cliff. And here's why we care about that. If we get to live on that big green area there, what happens when we're only living on oil finds that come in at 3 to 1? Well, this is the world we live in. There's just a whole lot less green that we get to operate society in. That means there's less energy for us to do with what we please to do with it. That means that we will have less complex societies. It means our economy will no longer